Era, medieval age. This is the spiritual progeny of Roll Through the Ages. It is a dice game, and while that game was mainly a roll and write, this is a game with impressive production values, a much larger game in which you don't just collect quantities of things, but you will collect resources. Yes, you still do that, but then you will also use those to build your own town, and you will do so using these three-dimensional miniature buildings that are of very high quality, and you have a lot of them. I would say one thing that makes the game not impractical, but a little bit cumbersome at the beginning is that you will need to divide all of these buildings in separate areas that all the players can have access to, and then, well, you need to kind of like keep them a little bit divided from one another so that during gameplay you're not slowed down because you don't know, oh, where's the monastery, where's the hospital, but still very impressive, very high production values. The cathedral, the monastery, for example, the hospital, and so on and so forth. Really cool stuff. Now, at its heart, however, the game is still a dice game. You have a nice bunch of custom dice, and each die represents a unit of your population. The more dice you have, the more things you produce, but also the more food you need to avoid disasters. Disasters will accumulate during the game, and that's bad. Each disaster point that you have is a penalty, is -1 victory point at the end of the game. Here you have a track to record culture that will give you points. Here is where you keep track of the resources that you collect, and those are trade goods, stone, wood, and food, and these are the amounts that you have at the beginning of the game, just standard setup. At the beginning of the game you also get a farm, 3 longhouses, 3 sections of wall, and a keep. The keep must go in the middle of your town. The other things can be placed wherever you like. This is a decent setup, or one that I like. You also start with these 3 dice, the yellow dice representing farmers, and this die here representing a knight. The turn has several steps, and that's why you designate a player as the player that announces, now we do that step, now that step, now that step, and so on and so forth. The first step is rolling dice, so pretty much like you expect in a lot of dice games. You roll the dice, and then you can choose to re-roll any die that does not show the skull symbol here. And so, for example, if I wanted to re-roll these 2, I wouldn't be able to re-roll, and suppose I decide to re-roll this one, and I get this, and I decide to re-roll this one, and I do this, and I decide to stop. Basically, you have a basic roll, and then up to 2 re-rolls of any die that did not show a skull. After everybody has rolled and possibly re-rolled their dice, it's time to proceed to the next phase, which is collection. This is where players collect resources. So first you collect the resources produced by your dice. I made 3 food because of that. 1, 2, 3. And I record that. These 2 here give me 2 woods, 1 wood each, and I get that. Also, if you have a farm, each farm will produce 1 food, and then if you have lumber mills each in your town, that's a building you can build later, then each will produce 2 woods. Now it's time to feed your people. You need a unit of food for each die that you have. So, for example, now I would need 4 units of food, which I have, and so that's easy, and I just spend that food. As simple as that. As the game progresses, you may acquire more dice. That means each round you need to produce more food. For each die that you can't feed, you're gonna acquire a disaster point that you record here on this track. After that, we look at the disaster icons. Each player in a turn order will announce how many disasters they have, and you resolve those effects based on, well, on what you see in the rule book, and also that is summarized on the back of this screen here, which is an excellent player aid. As a screen, you don't need it all that much. You need it only during setup, but as a player aid, this is fantastic. The interesting thing about the disasters is that some disasters will affect you, which makes sense, that's what you expect, but some affect other people. Yes, you read that right. I had to read like 5 times to convince myself that that's how it was. So actually, there's a push your luck in which you don't always necessarily want to avoid skulls. Maybe if I have 2 skulls and I re-roll because I'm hoping to make a third one, because 3 skulls is bad for my opponent as opposed to 2 is bad for me. So if at the end of my rolls have a single skull showing, then I'll get a disaster point on this track, or I choose to lose any one resource, which is often a good idea because each of these points is -1 victory point at the end of the game. You don't want that. 2 disasters, I get a disaster point for each cluster building, by which we mean buildings that are touching, not just by the corner like those 2, but by a side. Like these 2 would count as cluster. And that's why at some point you may want to build a hospital, because buildings that are adjacent to hospitals don't count as cluster. So having 2 skulls may be pretty catastrophic or not a problem at all if your buildings are not clustered. At the end of the game, having buildings surrounded by walls is also good, which is where is the trade-off. If you pack them, then you can surround a lot with your walls at risk of diseases if you don't have a hospital. How timely, by the way, in times of pandemic. Or if you spread them around, you don't have to worry about clusters, but it's going to be a lot harder to surround them with walls. That's if you get 2 disasters. If 3 skulls are showing treacheries, the opponents must scorch one of the involved areas, which means they need to add one of these scorch markers on their personal player aid, on their personal in their personal town, and you cannot build there, so that sucks. 4, lose a building, as simple as that. 5, the opponents lose an unwalled buildings. 6 or more, you lose all of your trade goods, which are very valuable goods, not so easy to come by. You need to get special dice usually to get better chances. The knight may give you 1, but it's not that likely. So this is how we've resolved the disasters in this phase of the turn. Now everybody's favorite phase is when we build. Each player can build a building for each hammer showing on their dice. So for example, I have 2. I can build up to 2 buildings. To build buildings, I will consume resources here. I will spend them. And the player aid here tells me what I can build. For example, for a single stone, I can build a section on a wall of any length among those available. There are, in the set, you have walls of different lengths. Not the scorch area, of different lengths is short, long, medium, and they all cost 1. And suppose on my 2 buildings, I decide to build a wall. And booyah, and I place it there, because that's where I like my wall to be. Or maybe I decide to spend 2 rocks, if I have them, and I build a townhouse. If I can find one, I build a townhouse, and the advantage is I get a burger. I love burgers, awesome. I hope it's a double stacker with pepper jack, cheese, and bacon. So you get a burger, and the burger brings a die along. And so now you have that population. Basically what you have here is a reminder of the shape of the building you're looking for, the cost that you need to pay for, victory points the building will be worth at the end of the game, and then the immediate effect, immediate or whatever other effect you have. Sometimes it's an immediate effect, that is you get a die. Some of the times you get to collect stuff each turn. Other effects like adjacent buildings are immune to disease. With a monster you get to set a die after the first roll, before the other rolls, and then here you have other effects which are victory points at the end of the game. And finally, we have extortion, because that's what people like to do in the Middle Ages. Players go around and you get to demand a good, and you ask for a specific good from each player that has fewer swords than you showing, unless they have equal or more shields than the swords that you have. So for example, one of my friends has 3 swords, I don't get to extort from them. Another player has 1 sword only, then I can say, hey, give me that, whatever it is. And unless they give it to me, then they get a disaster point. Pretty much that's how it works. And then we go back, roll, collect, feed, resolve disasters, build buildings, extort, and we continue like this. Now, there's going to be a certain number of these tokens in the game, depending on the number of players. Each time that somebody builds the last of a kind of building, last monastery, last hospital, last farm, whatever it is, we flip one of these like this as a reminder that that kind of building is gone. And when all of the tokens in play in that game show the X, then the game is over. And then at that point you score points. Scoring can be a little elaborate, and here you have a scoring player rate that you really need. So first, for each building, you score the corresponding amount of points indicated there. But, plot twist, if the building is within a fully walled area, you double that. And so monastery or university in a walled area, very valuable. Walled means you need the walls all around. It's not as obvious because one is tempted to put 2 walls there and call that one a walled area, but the edges don't have any wall. You actually have to put a wall on the edges to completely surround an area with walls. So first, each player scores all points from their buildings. Then we're gonna have special buildings that score in a specific way. If you have a market in your play area, then all empty squares around it are worth a point each, or totally not diagonally. The guild hall will give you points based on trade goods that you have. University bonus is based on culture, and cathedral bonus is based on how many dice you have. Again, culture also gives you points. That is, each point of culture that you have, that you will produce through effects and dice, each point of culture is a victory point. The player with the most culture scores 5 points, and I've seen players winning with like 1 culture points, getting the most because the player has 0. Then the most walled area. Again, you look at the walled area, how many dots are within, how large it is. The player with the largest walled area scores 10 points. Each disaster point is a penalty of 1 victory point. Total all the points from all sources, and the player with the highest score wins the game. So in these difficult days of pandemic, of summer 2020, I finally decided to have a friend over to have a mini game event with a single friend. I'm not ready to have many friends here in the game room, so it was a single friend. We were sitting outside on a lawn table and sitting on the opposite corners of the table, wearing masks all the time. And such I was looking for games that would work well in that setting. Turns out Era Medieval Age works very well, because it's not like a card drafting game. We're touching the same components. There isn't a board that we both share, and so we have to be close to each other as we're moving components on the same board. Pretty much you put the supply in the middle of the 2 players. The 2 players can sit pretty far, and that's it. Actually, within games, you can wipe everything with a disinfectant cloth or anything like that, because the game pieces that are shared, because after 1 game I take my buildings, I put them back in the supply, those are all made of plastics. You can disinfect them and there's absolutely no problem. And we never exchange any physical components throughout the game. The buildings, the dice, everything can be disinfected. So actually, it's a game that just works very well if you want to be safe, if you care about your friends, if you don't want to get sick, and most importantly, you care about other people and you don't want them to get sick in case you are and you don't know it. Here, Medieval Age works perfectly that way. It's a great game for the weird times that we are currently going through. Aside from that, as its own, it's also a really strong design. I like the original game that this is based on. And now with these other production values, with these different effects, the game is even better. Because it has so many paths to victory, so many things to consider. It is so much more than your usual Yahtzee with a couple of other things placed around it to make it look different. It plays and feels differently precisely because, well, you have the push your luck with a new element. I want to get one extra penalty. I don't have enough penalties. You don't feel very often that way in games. But then once you do that, you collect your stuff. There are just so many different things. I have 2 builds, and that's a whole other almost micro game or mini game, unless that is the main game, of which buildings do I build and where do I place them. So the whole spatial elements is you are, again, in a sense, pushing your luck. I'm gonna wall a large area, which is gonna pay off bigly if I can wall it off entirely. And that's an interesting thing, is that the end of the game is controlled by the players. So actually, if I start getting too ambitious, too obviously, and my opponent sees that, then they can start building cheap buildings, or maybe not so cheap, but that there aren't many in supply, boom, to shut down the game. And so you have a nice element here because, well, push your luck in something very ambitious, but if the opponent wants a short game, you'll get in trouble, or just try to score something small, but the opponent maybe stealthily is doing something bigger and has a bigger synergy. So you have so much variety because it's different buildings in different orders, placed in different positions on the map, and I would say with different levels of ambition. Again, going for the big project that can pay off a lot, or for a lot of small different things. The game looks amazing, plays very smoothly, plays intuitively, which I wasn't sure when I read the manual, and a turn has so many passages. I was a little bit suspicious, but then in actuality, gameplay is so very intuitive, smooth, fluid, a lot of things happen at the same time. With experienced players, of course, if you are a committed player, you trust your opponents. The more you love games, the less likely it is that people that love games and play with you are going to cheat, which could be very easy here. But again, you're not going to do it because you're a committed player, and so are your friends, and they are good people, and so are you. So many parts of the turn can be done simultaneously. Then when you're inflicting excruciating pain on each other thanks to the disaster, when you're extorting stuff, then it's sequential. But again, that's fun because it's confrontational. So actually you have also this nice element that most of the game may feel like a multiplayer solo, and yet it ain't, because there's still a lot of things that you can do to get in each other's way. So to me, this game really achieves a nice balance between so many different things, between planning and luck, between solitaire planning and interaction. I'm attacking you, sending disasters, shutting the game down because I think I'm ahead. And so just so many different things with such high production values, with such intuitive gameplay, that I find this to be really remarkable. Again, the only small, totally microscopic minus is you have to keep all of the components in the supply organized, each group differently, and so to set up the game, make sure that everything is clearly define where everything is, because if you miss a building, you thought you used all the monasteries, turns out there was still one, that can affect gameplay. So just setup is not even very long, but you have to pay extra attention, even more than in usual games. It's a little bit cumbersome, but that is such a minor thing. Because overall, this game is very solid, really fun. I enjoyed it playing 2 players. I can't wait until I can have game night again so I can play it with more friends. I think it will work very well that way also. There will be a storm of disasters hitting everybody. It was already bad enough with 2 players. I can't imagine with rather 3 players extorting you or sending disasters, but that's part of the fun. Part of the fun of gaming is controlled pain in the hope of victory, but also in the certainty that you're going to have a good time with your friends. And Era Medieval Age is a game that will allow you to do so because it is a really strong game.